bonjour à tous, bienvenue à ce séminaire. Je suis Richard Ben, professeur à Sciences Po au Centre d'études européennes et de politique comparée et animateur de l'atelier interdisciplinaire de recherche sur l'environnement, membre aussi du Centre des politiques de la Terre. Our working language will be English today, so I switch to English to welcome you here and to tell you that this seminar is jointly organized by AIR, the Interdisciplinary Research Workshop on the Environment and Ecology in Sciences Po, and the IPGP, Institut de Physique du Globe in Paris. We are lucky and happy to host Stephen Porder, professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at Brown University, and currently Tocqueville-Fulbright Fellow at the IPGP. I will let Jérôme Gaillardet from IPGP introduce Stephen and the topics of his talk more in detail, and then chair the session. I just want to make a short announcement to let you know that our next seminar will be next week, next Monday, same time, on climate change after the election of Joe Biden. This seminar will be organized in partnership with Columbia University. And I would like to thank a few persons, Jérôme, who took the initiative of the seminar, and Charlotte Alpern for her help in arranging the session. We will have two discussions after the presentation of Stephen. Natalia Capellini from Sciences Po Liep and CE. Natalia holds a doctorate in history from the University of Versailles, and she wrote her thesis on dams in the Brazilian Amazon, environment, conflict, and politics in the planning on construction of Tucurui. I hope I'm not pronouncing this too bad. And Alvaro Artigas, who's associate researcher in Sciences Po at the CE, and holds a PhD in comparative politics from Sciences Po, develops research on transformation of development programs and their specific sectoral, environmental, territorial consequences in many countries, but Latin America in particular. So thank you, Natalia and Alvaro, for joining the discussion. And of course, thank you, Stephen, for your presence with us today. Jérôme, if you agree, I pass it to you.
Merci Richard. Je vais faire l'introduction de Stephen en français parce qu'il faut aussi qu'il pratique son français. Donc Stephen est professeur, comme tu l'as dit Richard, d'écologie et de biologie de l'évolution à l'université de Brown à Providence aux États-Unis. Il a un rôle important dans l'université également puisqu'il est assistant au provost, c'est-à-dire en gros chargé de mission auprès du président, on pourrait dire, pour les histoires de sustainability, ce qu'en français on appelle le développement durable. Donc il conseille l'université sur des solutions durables pour l'université, c'est important, et on a cette réflexion également à l'université de Paris et ailleurs. Stephen a fait sa thèse à Stanford en sciences en biologie. La manière dont on s'est rencontré avec Stephen, c'est qu'on a fait du terrain ensemble dans un des observatoires de la zone critique du réseau américain à Porto Rico. Stephen est spécialiste des forêts tropicales. Il s'intéresse à la manière dont l'écologie des forêts tropicales interagit en gros avec ce qui se passe dans le sol en particulier. Et c'est là ce qui nous réunit. Il est plutôt écologue, je suis plutôt géologue, et c'est comme ça que Stephen a postulé dans notre équipe à l'Institut de physique de Globe sur une bourse Fulbright Tocqueville qu'il a réussi à décrocher. C'est un prix très compétitif, très difficile à avoir et qui nous réjouit. Donc avec Stephen, on parle écologie et géologie en même temps, ce qui est rare parce qu'en général, Quand on a fait de l'écologie, on ne comprend pas ce que racontent les géologues, et quand on a fait de la géologie, on ne comprend pas ce que racontent les écologues. Donc c'est une des grandes fractures des sciences modernes qu'il faut combler, et Stephen est la personne parfaite pour cela. Voilà, I'm going to let you the floor. Stephen, I didn't say anything, bad. So, but I know you understood.
J'ai compris tout. Donc, merci Jérôme, merci Richard. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Je suis vraiment désolé à devoir parler en anglais, mais c'est plus facile pour moi et donc on y va. Ok, je vais share screen, c'est le mot en français, je pense. Alors, vous pouvez voir?
Yeah.
Ça marche? Okay. So thank you everyone for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here in Paris. I feel very fortunate to have made it in August and to still be here safe and sound in our third confinement. I want to talk to you today about some work that I've been doing in the Brazilian Amazon, but really work that is motivated by some of the large sort of overarching sustainability goals that Jérôme mentioned I was working on at Brown. And so this is really an intersection of my interest in basic science and my interest in bridging between basic science and society. And I want to start by thanking Fulbright and EPJ for providing me with the opportunity to be in residence here. I've learned a lot so far, and look forward to continuing to work with everyone here. So, okay. So I was fortunate enough to teach a class with Jérôme in the fall, and I stole this definition from one of his slides, although I modified it a little bit. And it says the critical zone is the area that lies between the rock and the sky, where water, air, and ecosystems and rock interact. But of course, in the 20th and the 21st century, humans have really become a driving force of the critical zone. And Jérôme spoke nicely of my combination of ecology and geology, but I think for those of us who are interested in the critical zone, it's incumbent upon us to reach beyond those disciplines and understand how the critical zone influences people and how those influences in turn change human behavior. And I'm very excited to be giving this lecture in your series because this interdisciplinary collaboration, I think, is the way forward on understanding some of the biggest challenges that we face in society over the coming decades. So I want to start, even though I am not a demographer or particularly a student of human behavior, with humans, and move my way back to the critical zone. And I want to start with this slide because I think it shows you the first reason why humans have become a dominant geologic force. For most of human civilization, our numbers were very low. But since about 1800, we've gone from 1 billion to over 7.5, soon to be 8 billion people on the planet. And this is really unprecedented growth for humans, of course, but really an unusual growth spurt for any species to persist for such a long time at low numbers and then explosively and so quickly change. And as a result, we are having a tremendous, as you know, environmental impact on the planet. For most of human history, the food required to fuel that population growth came from clearing additional land for food production. So I'm showing you here from the year 0 to the present, the growth in land devoted for crops. And you can see my cursor, I think, is that correct? Jérôme?
Yes, we can see it, Stephen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Land devoted to crop production going up exponentially with human population. The land devoted to grazing animals going up even more. And just for scale, the land covered by cities is shown here in yellow, and you can barely see it. In fact, today, the majority or half of the habitable land on the planet is devoted to food production. So this slide simply shows the Earth's land surface in brown, the part that is not either very, very arid desert or glaciated in orange, and the part devoted to food production in green. And I simply want to make the point that we have sort of run out of room for expansion. We now farm an area that, if you added up all the farms in the world, would cover South America. And we graze animals on an area, if you added up all that land, about the size of Africa. But something has changed since the Second World War. And one of the things that's changed, so while food production has increased since 1960, along with the world population, one of the things that has not changed, and this is a break from the rest of human history, is the area that we use to farm. So here I'm showing you crop production in the black dots going up over time from 1960 to the present. But the area harvested for crops has stayed pretty much flat. And the reason for this, of course, is that we have intensified agriculture. And I'm going to use that term a lot in this talk, so I want to define it here. First and foremost, that means we have started putting massive amounts of fertilizer on our croplands. We've also irrigated in places that were too dry to farm productively in the past. We've genetically modified seeds, either through traditional breeding techniques or through modern genomics, although not in Europe. And we've mechanized agriculture so that now a farmer can sit in their tractor and read the newspaper while the GPS plants or harvests, or drives the tractor and plants or harvests. The stories I'm going to tell you today focus on fertilizer. And so I want to make the point here that fertilizer is really at the heart of agricultural intensification. So what I'm showing you here is the production of fertilizer, nitrogen in blue, phosphorus and potassium in the pinkish colors. The story today is going to be mostly about phosphorus, but these three really have allowed food production to increase without changing area particularly much. And you can actually calculate how much food we could make without synthetic fertilizer. And it turns out that about half of the world population wouldn't be here without synthetic fertilizer. It's why the advent of nitrogen fertilizer is often called the most significant invention that you've never heard of. Although I imagine people here have heard of it. Now, of course, fertilizer is not without problems. So if you go to the US EPA, which I'm grateful to say now exists again, you'll find this text saying that nutrient pollution is one of America's most widespread, costly, and challenging environmental problems. And if you go to the European Environment Agency, you will find similar text. And essentially the problem here is that when fertilizer runs off of farm fields, it fuels algae growth. That algae growth can, when that algae decomposes, it can consume oxygen and produce dead zones. And this is a common problem with fertilizer, that it adds to both air and water pollution. So a critical question moving forward, and I use that word purposefully, is over the next couple of decades to 3 decades, the world population is going to continue to grow, probably reaching about 10 billion by mid-century. And we have to ask ourselves as a society, how are we going to increase food production to fuel that growth? Now, there are lots of people working on this from lots of different perspectives, and climate change is clearly going to challenge places that are already very productive. And it will be a challenge to keep them, to keep increasing productivity. But I want to focus, instead of focusing on that question, I want to focus on the interaction between the critical zone and farming. And I want to focus on it at a sort of global scale, absent climate change. And then I'm happy to talk about climate change in the Q&A if people are interested. So today's talk is really going to focus on 3 basic questions. What are the environmental effects of agricultural intensification? How does the critical zone influence these effects? And I'm going to tell you a couple of sort of short vignettes, short stories about to try and give you a sense of these questions. And then I'm going to try to draw some broader lessons from those case studies. So to start off, I want to start with this map, and I want to take a minute to explain it because it's not intuitive. I also want to apologize to those people who are red-green colorblind, which is about 9% of males. I didn't make this map in this color scheme, and I didn't have time to change it. What this map is showing is all of the world's croplands, and they're colored by the amount of crop per area that they're producing compared to the sort of best available practices. So what I mean by that is in the places that are colored dark green, that means that crop productivity is as high as we know how to make it, given the climate and the soil of that place. Where you see red, there's room for dramatic improvement in the amount of crops you can get from a given parcel of land. And there's some reason, often lack of access to fertilizer or other things, that is driving that difference. So I started by talking a little bit about the US and Europe and nutrient pollution, and I want to focus in here to start, to think about the conceptual framework that I brought to the question that's at the top of the screen. So when I started working on this in, say, 2008 or so, I wanted to understand the environmental effects of agricultural intensification. And most of the studies that I was aware of had been done in the US and Europe, where, of course, industrial agriculture had been going in its modern form since the early 1950s. I want to make the point that the critical zone drives environmental consequences of industrial agriculture, and I'm going to make it using a somewhat obscure map. So this is a map showing not the percent yield, crop yield that different places get, but rather the soil types. And I've deliberately taken the names of soil types off of this map because soil scientists, like other scientists and other scholars, like to shroud their ideas in jargon that no one else outside their group understands. And so if I put the names up, it wouldn't matter much to most of the people on this lecture anyway. I want to just make a general point about the soils in the US and in Europe. And of course, it's an overgeneralization since you can't generalize across two continents. But in general, with that caveat, the soils in the US and Europe are very fertile topsoils. That's why they have fueled such great agricultural productivity over centuries. Below that topsoil is, in general, a relatively poorly drained layer. That means that if you get really high amounts of rainfall, you get flooding in the farm fields and erosion and standing water. But fortunately, relative to the tropics at least, most of the farm regions we farm are relatively low rainfall. I want to focus the first part of this story on the poor drainage. So here's a cornfield in the Midwestern United States after a particularly bad rainstorm, or actually not a particularly bad rainstorm. And you can imagine that this is an economic problem caused by the critical zone in a way, also caused by agricultural practices. And people have gone to great lengths to ameliorate such problems. So if you were to peel back the soil from this field, you would see something that looks like this. All the farm fields pretty much in the American Midwest are underlain by a really extensive set of drains that are meant to take water away from the crops when there's too much water. Unfortunately, that also removes soil and nutrients. And if you walk to the edge of a farm field, what you'll see are these pipes every few meters or so that take water and nutrients and soil directly from the field, dump it into a drainage ditch. And that drainage ditch then, packed with nutrients, connects to waterways and flows towards the ocean. If you look at the global distribution of drainage systems under farm fields, you'll see that the American Midwest, for example, has up to 75% of the land drained by these sort of piping systems, by this plumbing. And Europe is, at least Northern Europe, is very similar. It looks like a regular field and just soil, but there's a lot of drainage and has historically been a lot of drainage in Europe for a very long time. As a result, our coasts across the eastern United States, across northern Europe, are often choked with algae that then when they die, their decomposition consumes oxygen, and we are faced with perennial or episodic dead zones where fish and shellfish can't persist in shallow environments when the ocean conditions are right. So it's within this context of fertilizer fueling massive agricultural production and the downside of nutrient runoff from drainage systems and soil erosion. It's within that context that I started to think about the way the critical zone, the way that differences in the critical zone might influence agricultural outcomes elsewhere. So I'm going to tell you two stories about this. The first one is about drainage. And I'm going to compare the high input agriculture of the US and Europe that we were talking about to the high input agriculture in Brazil. Now, this is a more recent trend, and I'll talk about the land use history in this part of the world in just a minute. But this is the same graph and what you can, or same map in terms of what it's showing you. And what it's showing you here are these bright green dots that are showing you very high agricultural yields, as high as anywhere in the world, in the southern Brazilian Amazon and Cerrado, the savanna to the south of the Amazon. And it's here that I want to focus our attention for just a minute. First, by switching from the soil map that showed you the US and Europe, which had, again, poor drainage and fertile topsoil and low rainfall, and switching now to the site in the Amazon, which is almost exactly the opposite. The critical zone there is highly weathered. It's a stable continental setting that has been sitting basically unmoved by tectonics for a very long time under very warm temperatures and very high rainfall. As a result, the soils are very deep, but they do drain extremely well, and that's and they in addition have higher rainfall than the agricultural breadbaskets of the U.S. and Europe. So let's focus there for a minute. I'm going to take you now to South America, to Brazil, and to Mato Grosso specifically. Mato Grosso spans the transition between the forest, which is to the north of basically the words, and the savanna to the south, the Cerrado to the south. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the land use history. Until about the 1980s, this region was largely intact, at least in Mato Grosso. And you can see these sort of invaginations of light green into the forest, and those are recently cleared. They were cleared in the 80s for pasture, by and large. Advances in agricultural science, both in Brazil and elsewhere, allowed the cultivation of soybeans to begin in the early 2000s. And that's been followed by what we call double cropping, which is soy followed by corn in the same year. And Brazil, largely as a result of this soybean expansion in Mato Grosso, is now the world's second largest soy producer, basically tied with the United States. The critical zone properties are very different, though. And what I want to focus on here is this deep, at least at first, is this idea that these are deep, well-drained, but highly infertile soils. So within this context, I want to introduce you to our study site specifically, and I'm going to leave up the map of South America to give you a sense of the scale. So that white dot that just appeared on your screen, I'll do it again in case you were taking a sip of coffee. That white dot that just appeared on your screen is actually pretty much actual size for the farm that we work on. This is what it looks like from the air. These are 1 kilometer blocks, and the farm itself is over 50 kilometers long. And about 20 kilometers wide. It's not nearly the biggest farm in the region. On the ground during the soybean growing season, it looks just like any other farm that you might encounter. It just looks like a soybean farm. I want to particularly call out my former graduate student, Shelby Hayho-Riskin, who did a lot of this work and did it well. So as I said, this looks a lot like any other farm. You wouldn't know you were in the Amazon, but if you look closely every once in a while, you can tell that things are a little different. You often see jaguars and tapirs wandering through the soy fields, which is kind of interesting. And we were really interested in the effects of intensive agriculture on many different ecosystem and human properties. And so Shelby set up, along with colleagues, this really neat experimental design. I'm going to take a minute to show you. So on the right panel here, you're seeing an outline of the farm itself. By law, by Brazilian Forest Code, half of the land has to remain in forest, and that's shown in gray. And Shelby selected watersheds, headwaters of watersheds, that were either entirely covered in forest, shown here in green, or entirely within soybean fields, shown here in the sort of rust color in the white, which is the cleared area. So we were able to use this experimental design to ask the question, how does the water leaving soybean fields differ from the water flowing out of the forest, and how does the critical zone structure that outcome? So the first thing we noticed was actually work from the farm field itself. So one of the big problems in the US that I forgot to mention earlier and in Europe is that if you run tractors over these farm fields all the time, the soil starts to compact, and that means even more overland loss of water. In the case of Brazilian soy, that's true too. So on the y-axis here, I'm showing you how much water can flow into the soil in millimeters per hour. And you can see that there's higher ability to absorb water in the forest than in the soy. So that's in one way similar. But what's different between this graph and what you might see in the US is the most rainfall you ever get in an hour is all the way down here. And so we never see the kind of ponded water in the fields that you would see in Iowa or in Europe. It's not a concern. We also measured the nutrient fluxes out of these farm fields. And interestingly, there are very high fertilizer inputs to these farm fields, but very low pollution. So what I'm showing you here is the nitrate, that's the nitrogen and phosphorus losses from the farm fields. Again, the green is forest and the orange or whatever is soy. And what you can see is that the losses overlap completely. There's really no difference. And the reason for this is, again, the critical zone. Farmers are dumping an enormous amount of fertilizer onto the landscape, but the deep soils and the particular kinds of clays that are in those soils act as a giant filter and retain all of those nutrients in place. They don't reach the rivers. This is entirely different than the consequences of agriculture in either the US or Europe. Another big difference is how much deforestation or how much more water flows out of the streams in the soybean fields than in the forests. So this is a rather complicated graph. I'm going to take a minute to walk you through it. The gray bars show you show you the amount of rain coming in across a year. So you can see there's a very pronounced rainy season from November to about April, and then it really dries up for the rest of the year. The forest water streams flow very steadily all year round. The soybean streams are a little bit more variable, but the big thing I want to draw your eye to is that about 4 times as much water is coming out of these streams draining soybean fields than the streams draining forests. And the reason for that is that forests are incredible recyclers of water. So about half of the rainfall in the Amazon actually is pumped through the trees before it falls back down. And when you remove the trees, you lose the pump. Instead of going back to the atmosphere, you start to see more water accumulating in streams. For my European friends, this building over here is for drying genetically modified soy to send to China. And this building, I believe over here is the one that's not genetically modified to send over here. So you can see they're paying very close attention to European demands. So I want to talk a little bit more about this water story because it's really quite fascinating. We've recently been doing, or other groups have recently been doing work to understand how the extra water going out in rivers because of deforestation might affect the regional climate. And so what I'm showing you here is a climate model of the state, showing you the rainy season length, sort of under historical conditions with very little deforestation. And it doesn't particularly matter, the colors are going from blue, which is a long rainy season to redder colors that is a shorter rainy season. When you run a regional climate model and you say, well, what's the decade going to look like, or the 2 decades going to look like if we had just 2005 land use? That is, we cleared all the trees up to 2005. What you can see is a drying pretty much everywhere. In other words, the rainy season is getting shorter. And if you do the same modeling exercise, but you assume continued deforestation, which unfortunately is the case, what you see is a strong regional drying, especially in the savanna areas or just southeast of the forest border in the southeast of the state. So what does this mean? Why does this matter? Well, the length of the rainy season is really critical to the farmer's ability to plant 2 crops in one season. So what I'm showing you here is a map from 2001 and another one from 2017. And all I want to draw your eye to is this, or 2 things. One, this sort of brown color, which you can see in the middle of this map, is all of the places where they're doing 2 crops in 1 year. Soybeans harvested, corn is planted 2 hours later by another truck, another tractor, another combine, and another crop before the end of the rainy season. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is the difference between the amount of pasture in the north in 2001 to the amount of pasture in the north after in 2017. And this is what's driving the regional drying. So as a result of all of this deforestation, the double cropping that has sprung up in the last 2 decades is now being squeezed by an ever shortening rainy season. Now, my colleagues on the social science side have been exploring the social and economic effects of double cropping. And it turns out that double cropping is really important for the people of the region. On average, regions that have double cropping have higher urban growth, higher incomes, better access to medicine, better access to education. So this interaction between the critical zone, the loss of water as a result of deforestation, is threatening to play into the very driver of economic success that is occurring in the region. I look forward to my colleagues who know much more about the social side of things in Brazil than I, chiming in on this idea during the discussion. So some of the questions or some of the ideas I want you to take from the first part of this story is that critical zone properties shape the environmental and human consequences of agriculture, but also that human changes to the critical zone have both environmental and societal consequences. And this is not a story that is unique. Of course, we learn about this all the time. We hear about this with climate change, but this is one example where the very nature of the soil and the very nature of the organisms that have evolved on that soil has a pronounced impact that we can trace very directly. I want to just spend a brief amount of time on another little vignette in the same region before going on to some broader lessons. And here I want to focus on the fact that the soils in this part of the world require very high phosphorus inputs. So if you recall, I said that the increase in food production since 1960 has really been fueled by our use of fertilizer. And phosphorus is unique because like oil, it is finite. Nitrogen, which is shown here in blue, is not finite. We can get as much as it as we want as long as we have energy to get it. It's irreplaceable. So this is unlike oil, which we can replace with renewables. So it is both finite and irreplaceable. It is mined from the earth like oil. And it is very unevenly distributed. So the vast majority of the world's phosphate deposits are in Morocco. It's very difficult to know how much is in China, but outside of Morocco and China, there's almost none. And so there's a lot of debate about how long these reserves will last. But I think the more interesting question is, given that all farming depends on phosphorus fertilizer, and certainly the Brazilian case does, what are the geopolitical implications of the distribution of this finite resources? There certainly have been geopolitical implications to the distribution of oil, which is perhaps the best analog. Now, the reason I'm talking about phosphorus in this case is because just like the critical zone in the US and Europe are different in their drainage properties, they're also different in the way that they interact with phosphorus fertilizer. So this is a map that's showing you whether or not soils hold on to phosphorus fertilizer really tightly and render that phosphorus fertilizer unavailable to the crops that are growing there, or whether, and that's shown in purple, and in green, the soils sort of are the opposite. They don't have that property. And what you can see, of course, in this diagram is that in the United States, for example, much of the upper Midwest Corn Belt is not on soils that really stick to phosphorus fertilizer. The Southeast is a different story. As a result, the United States, sort of circa the mid-1950s, rapidly increased its phosphorus consumption, but then quickly, as lakes and rivers started to be choked with algae, we realized that we could back off on phosphorus application, and the value of agriculture continued to increase. So these black lines are decadal trends, and you can see a massive increase in phosphorus fertilizer use, and then a continued use of phosphorus fertilizer, but an increase in the value of agriculture. And that's because we over-fertilized in the 70s and in the 80s, and that's allowed us to back off. The soils have sort of held on to the phosphorus for us, but not held on to it so tightly that we couldn't get it back. In Europe, the case is even more dramatic. So Europe started in the 50s and 60s ramping up fertilizer, and over-fertilization in Europe, where there are almost no soils that really tightly hold phosphorus, allowed a backing off of fertilization. So here, phosphorus fertilizer inputs have diminished, even as the value of agriculture has stayed constant. And these are all in constant dollars, by the way. So the question, or the idea I want to talk about for Brazil, is how does the critical zone interact with phosphorus fertilizer? And you can see from this map, and the fact that it's all purple, that the critical zone here is very different. The clays in the soil in Brazil, by and large, stick to phosphorus fertilizer and render it unavailable to crops, or less available to crops. So again, I want to zoom in on Mato Grosso, shown here in the inset. And I want to give credit to my postdoc, Eric Roy, and undergrad, Ned Willick, who did the vast majority of this work. And what they did is they, working with a social scientist who was interested in other questions, drove around to a whole bunch of farms in the region, spanning the forest to grassland transition. And they asked farmers about their use of fertilizer, and they collected soils to try and understand the environmental consequences of that fertilizer use. So first to the surveys. When we ask farmers how much fertilizer they're putting in, the numbers don't particularly matter. They're putting in probably double what you would do in the US, or maybe even triple, as the US has backed off, similar to Europe. The US and Europe are similar, I'm sorry. If you look at how much fertilizer or phosphorus actually comes off the field when you harvest the soybeans, it's only half of that. So what that means is that the critical zone, the soils in this part of the world, are holding on to roughly half of the fertilizer. And given that fertilizer is something like 25 to 40% of the farm costs for these farmers, this is a huge implication. What's even more interesting is that our soil sampling revealed, and I'm sorry this graph is a little confusing, I'll walk you through it. Our soil sampling revealed that even after 30 years of dumping fertilizer, twice as much fertilizer on as they took off in harvest, the soils were not really saturating. They were still hungry for phosphorus. So on the y-axis here, I'm showing you the percentage of phosphorus saturation. If this were a graph of Iowa or Europe, it would be close to 100% for a lot of soils. And Brazil, even after 30 years of farming, you're still in the single digits. These soils have an enormous capacity to bind phosphorus. So when we look at the sort of implications of this, I'm now putting those same two graphs of the USA and Europe here. So again, this is US phosphorus use over time. And you can see that for the same phosphorus inputs, the value of agriculture has increased. In Western Europe, for the same value of agriculture, you've actually been able to really back off of phosphorus fertilizer use. But Brazil, our projections are that if they are going to increase the value of agriculture, as they certainly are trying hard to do, they will demand more and more phosphorus inputs imported because they don't have their own supplies, and with the concomitant geopolitical implications. Okay, so who cares about phosphorus fertilizer in Brazil? Many people, but perhaps not that many. And so I want to try and end this talk with some broader lessons from about what we can learn from our case studies. So I motivated this talk by asking, how will food production increase? And there are lots of answers to this question, including feeding fewer crops to animals, reducing food waste. But one of the major ways that people are envisioning an increase in the global food supply, particularly because malnutrition and hunger are dominant in the places where there is not access to fertilizer, is by thinking about how to export the Brazilian model of intensive agriculture to other tropical regions where productivity is not as high as it could be. This is already happening. There are major connections between Brazilian agricultural agencies and agencies in Africa. China is exporting its labor force and agricultural practices to Africa as well. So this is ongoing. And I think the first point I want to make is that we looked into a very simple question, which is, if you were to export the Brazilian model to all of the phosphorus binding soils in the world that are currently under cropland, would it matter? And the answer is, if we expand the Brazilian model, it will increase the demand for this finite and irreplaceable ore by about 25%. That is not an impossible number to imagine, but it is certainly a big one, and one that will affect, if not the sort of hastening of the demise of our ore deposits, at least the price. That's especially true because much of the phosphorus that's added will get stuck on the soils and the crops won't be able to take it up. And so there's a lot of research to be done and being done on how to increase the availability of phosphorus in soils where it's there, but the plants can't get at it. I think more generally, what I would like to leave you with is the idea that, as with many other grand environmental and societal challenges, the critical zone will shape the consequences that we face in our attempt to feed 10 billion people. And without understanding the critical zone and human interactions with it, and the way that it is shaped by humans and the way its properties shape human behavior, we are less likely to be able to do that in a sustainable way that is equitable and promotes a better access to food for everyone on the planet. So with that, I think I will stop and say thank you very much for having me. It was really fun putting this talk together, and I will stop sharing my screen and be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Stephen, am I supposed to share? Yes.
I don't know what the rule is.
Oui, c'est toi, Jérôme.
Okay, so maybe I should give the floor to our invited speakers, Natalia and Alvaro, if they want to add something or comment on Stephen's talk.
Sure.
No, Natalia, go first, please.
Okay. So thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation, and thank you, Stephen, for this very interesting and kind of, for me, it was very different than what I'm used to hear about the Amazon. Anyway, this idea of using this concept of critical zone can be very interesting for environmental historians, for instance, as the scale of analysis of human society relationships. So thank you for this presentation. So since I'm a historian of the Amazon, I was thinking about taking you back, all of you back a few years before what this process that Stephen is telling us. So to think a little bit about how this clearing of forest started to make pasture and soy plantations and other kinds of farming as well. So to comment a little bit about the occupation of the Amazon forest and the expansion of the agricultural frontier in this region since the 70s. So I guess I don't know how much you all know about the history of Brazil, but Brazil historically played this role of a commodity exporter in international capitalist trade market since the colonial period. So we can remember the sugar cycle, precious minerals during the colonization, all dependent on the labor of enslaved people. And after we have coffee, rubber, cocoa, and this continues until today with soya and other products. And how the Amazon fits in this? So the Amazon was always entangled in international trade dynamics since the colonization as well. But in the beginning, there was kind of it was some products like we call this drugs of the backlands that were exploited. So like salsa-parrilla, guaraná, and some kinds of woods and fragrances. But it was during the rubber cycle that we have intensification of trade relations with the Amazon region, especially in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, after Charles Goodyear discovered the vulcanization process and so started to make rubber for cars. And so in that time, rubber was almost exclusively exported from the Amazon. Like 80 or 90% was coming from the Brazilian Amazon. But since, even if we have like this product that was a commodity in international markets and was like the second export product in Brazil at the time, the Amazon remained intact. Nothing changed in terms of forest cover during this exploitation, because actually, as the very failed experience of Ford to make avia plantations in the Amazon would show, you cannot plant monocultures of avia in the region. It's important to keep in mind, as Stephen mentioned, that the Amazonian forest cover remained exactly the same until the military dictatorship that ruled Brazil between 1964 and 1985. What happened during that time? What happened is that the military dictatorship in Brazil, it implemented many development initiatives that triggered deforestation, environmental degradation, and especially a process of disorderly occupation that gave way to what we call today the Amazonian decades of destruction that lead until today. And it's important to understand this dynamic of big farms in the Amazon to think about this period. So it was because of what was thought of as the Amazonian geopolitical and strategic importance in the 60s and 70s. So we were in the Cold War, that the region became important in the development plans of the military regime. So they put a lot of money, administrative resources, and political resources to implement large-scale projects such as roads, agricultural colonization projects, industrial installations, dams, and many others. So this was at the basis of this process was two myths that were connected. This idea of the Amazon as a reserve of resources, so the granary of the world, as was suggested by German naturalist Humboldt. So this idea that the Amazon had all these riches that had only to be exploited. It was there waiting for somebody to do something. And the other myth was that it was an empty region that was isolated, that needed progress and needed to be integrated and secured within the Brazilian state. So it would not be taken by foreign countries or by internal guerrillas. So it was the fear of the Cold War, at the same time, the internal enemy and the external enemy. So because of that, or because of this paradigm of development and security for the Amazon region, the military dictatorship took this to its climax and put a lot of effort to develop this region especially in three phases. The first one, they decided, it's important to think about this because each of these phases of military action in the region will imprint specific features that gave way to the process that we see today that Stephen talked about. So the first one was the development through business investment. So they would create several fiscal incentives to put businessmen to invest in the region. After, they decided to make a social side of this program. So they decided to install, to start a small peasant colonization in the region, especially by opening roads and giving plots to families, landless peasant farmers. And the third phase was the industrialization of the Amazon, linking hydroelectricity development, mining, and an industrial project. But what is interesting about this time, and what I want you to think about in relation to this talk, is that big projects until then had a tendency to fail in the Amazon because like Fordlandia that I mentioned, this failed avea plantation by Ford, or the Jari cellulose project by American billionaire Daniel Ludwig, or a Volkswagen cattle farm in the Amazon. All these projects fail. And even the military dictatorship, road building and dam building, all had some like ironic twist at some point. It wasn't exactly, that didn't bring exactly the expected benefits. These experiences were built because there was a mix of ignorance of the local ecological context of the Amazon, and also economic ambitions and dreams of progress that together led to failure. But I want to stress the importance of politics in this discussion, because what the Amazon did in the what the military dictatorship did in the Amazon was part of a geopolitical project that the government made at that time, and that made them do certain choices. And while most of these projects end up failing, or at least didn't entail the projected development and economic growth or social growth that was supposed to lead, it leads to the foundation and the establishment of this dynamic that continues to haunt Brazilian society today. So the expansion of the agricultural frontier from the east to west of Brazil, the large infrastructure projects, and the opening of roads that created large migration to the region. And it's these people that today make these large farms and small farms and entail like large, a chaotic and violent state of land tenure and occupation in the region, because this farm that we observed in the beginning is far from being the norm. Most of the occupation in the region is, not, at least in other parts in the Amazon. Mato Grosso is more established today because it's closer to the rest of Brazil than to the middle of Amazonia. But the logical frontier is it entails a lot of conflict and violence between different people that are established in the same place, including criminal relations and tense relations with indigenous and traditional communities. So why does soy succeed where many other projects fail? And it's because it started later, and it builds up in this basis that the military dictatorship put in place. So you had new people, you had you had opening of roads in the region that allowed for transportation of products, and a huge investment of the Embrapa in the 90s, so the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation, to adapt soy production to the forest landscape. So I think it's important that we think about the destruction of the Amazon today, and the whole situation in the Amazon today that has gloomy projections of accelerating process of violence and deforestation. But to imagine how are we going to deal with this situation in the future? I think we have to, it's important to look at the past, because if we don't take seriously the origins and the history of these dynamics that threaten our ecosystem today, we might adopt inadequate solutions to meet the challenges of tomorrow. So I have many questions for Stephen, but maybe I'm gonna let Álvaro talk, and maybe in the questions I can come back. I don't know how.
Can I just actually say one thing? I wanted to show one slide just to highlight your point, and I agree with everything you said, and I think it's really, I'm curious to hear your and Álvaro's thoughts on, it's really different with these giant corporations running soy farms than it is with the first waves of deforestation in terms of their susceptibility to international pressure, for example, things like the soy moratorium, et cetera. But before I get there, I wanted to show everybody a little bit of the history up front and personal. So I didn't draw attention to it, but here's the ranch I'm talking about. This lobe of forest that persists surrounded by soy fields on both sides, and really enormous soy fields, is the upper headwaters of the Xingu River. And downstream, there's a lot of talk about dams. But here we have an indigenous population, several indigenous populations that are losing land every year to illegal deforestation on the edge. And where there, in some years, is stronger enforcement, the land use, the forest loss is less, and where in some years there's less enforcement, the forest loss is more. The regional drying is not only affecting farmers' ability to do double cropping, but it's affecting the timing of fruit production and the way of life of people within the reserve, because while this looks like a big chunk of forest, it's affected by changes in regional climate that have to do with deforestation. And so it's really important to think not just of the you know, what is this interaction with the critical zone doing to the people in the deforested part, but to remember that the Amazon is not empty land, and was not empty land even when the dictatorship started moving people or incentivizing people to move. And there are very big populations of people who have lived in this region for a very long time and are now, even if they are protecting the forest, experiencing the changes that are coming from outside, even if those changes don't include chainsaws, although they often do. So I just wanted to make that point. I'll stop sharing again, and then I can go to Álvaro.
Oh, thanks, Stephen, and thanks also to Natalia, because I think, and kudos to the organizers, because I think the different topics we're talking actually assemble quite well, and you guys can provide me with a lot of cues also to come up with some ideas. Well, first of all, what a great presentation, and how terrifying a presentation it was. Between, I would say it's not even between rock and sky. I'd say it's between a sword and a hard place. Right? This is truly where we are. I mean, you should maybe rephrase your presentation at some point, right? But no, seriously, I think it's really, I would really very much appreciate how you brought the industrialization dimension by exploring the phosphorus, the replaceable quality of phosphorus, because this is a big thing, and how in particular all the value chain of agro actually forces us to think in larger geopolitical terms as well. So there is a very important IR dimension connected to it. And it's funny that I should be talking from, actually right now I'm in Chile, where interestingly similar dynamics, even though the forest is not quite the same, but similar dynamics have also been the result of this very reactive agricultural stance by Brazil and Chile, you know, adapting to international markets at one point, adjusting their production to Asian demands. And we see several of the same dynamics working with the same dramatic environmental consequences. So one of the things that maybe I'd like to bring forth, just to complete what was mentioned before, is some elements from the structural political economic basis of substantiation of this model, which I think have led to these choices and in the more recent decades, and maybe exploring a little bit more also what how public action and policy making in Brazil in relation to this has taken place, and the role of international funding and ODA, and how all these different elements walk together. So maybe very briefly, I'd like to say that first of all, we work in the Brazilian context with these two contending structural forces. The first one, it's a little bit development model driven, among others, of course, by traditional agrarian oligarchies and alliances gravitating in relation to it. And I think this is important, in particular, looking at the Brazilian Senate, which has been a very important driver of these forces, which led to a running joke some years ago about the very architecture of Congress. And I don't know if I can share the screen right now with you all. I don't know if I don't think I have the privilege.
Marina can give you power, but it's hers to give.
Yeah, it's hers to give. Well, but basically the Brazilian Congress had a very bizarre architecture. It was designed by Oscar Niemeyer, the famous architecture, and you have a reverse plate and an open plate. So the whole joke was that the open plate was Congress and they were still eating, and the Senate was a reverse plate, which meant they already ate and they were content with their situation. So see, I think it's a very good graphication of what you mentioned. But more fundamentally, it meant that there was this alliances and this coalition of players that would support this agro-industrial endeavor. And this, as a matter of fact, would be supported even further by the economic forces that drove much of Brazil's development in recent decades, like the Brazilian Development Bank. As a matter of fact, the Brazilian Development Bank has been a very important driver of the internationalization of agro groups, and in particular, the assisting of the fusion of Sadia, JBS into Brazil Foods, and this huge mega conglomerate that actually allowed for the production to double, for instance, regarding meat production, that is directly concerned with what you are mentioning in your presentation, and the doubling of exportations of Brazil's meat production to China and Asia in general. So this is, for me, it's a very important composition of this coalition supporting these forces, because this is something that is structural to much of Brazil development over the last decade. So I do this in order to extract it from the more recent narrative regarding the government of Jair Bolsonaro. I think there is something, and as Natalia mentioned in his very insightful introduction, we are witnessing here a long path-dependent trajectory where these forces have been at play, have been supported, and actually have been reinforcing by the dynamics of the international economy and globalization. So this is a very important element. The other element that is key to understand this setup, I think, is also the very, I would say, a limited priority, and I would say limited means that have been allocated to the conservation and the monitoring of what was going on in the Amazon, in the sense that it was not so much the result of funding that was stemming out of a national budget, but it was most significantly the result of international donors and funders, in particular the government of Norway, supporting the Fundo Amazonia, that would contribute greatly to staffing of the agencies in charge of monitoring, would be in charge of, at one point, securing also the technological means for this monitoring to go through, and at one point, trying to halt, in as much as it was possible, in the face of these very powerful structural forces, whatever was going on. And the interesting point is that in as much as these agencies would be supported by this international funding, in as much as there would be a very, I would say, active NGOs, mobilized as to monitor, and the scientific community, the CNPq, this is very important to mention that. The fact is that they were rather weak in their own, and that made them a very easy prey under the Bolsonaro government, who actually proceeded to dismantling these different agencies' means and capacity to come up with articulated responses in the face of this deforestation. So more fundamentally regarding the consequences of this to public action, I'd say that one of the big problems were that more fundamentally, given everything that I said, and given also the trajectory of development of Brazil, that put a high price on fast economic growth, put a high price in fast infrastructural growth, and actually infrastructure supporting the enhanced extractivism of the area you mentioned. And this is why I was so pleased with the cues you brought in your presentation. The problem is that this led to conservation policies to be subordinated or downsized and to be put very low in the priorities of the policy agenda. and in particular, given the fast integration between BRIC countries, Brazil and China. And another element that also is the result of this particular configuration, had direct consequences in the public action carried through these recent decades, is also the fact that the revenue obtained by the agro-industrial sector. I like the way it's phrased in Portuguese. It's called agronegócio, which agribusiness. Actually, it conveys very well this idea. Actually, it was key for the very important redistributive policies that were carried out by the Brazilian state. So to a certain extent, the social objectives of the Brazilian state led to a situation whereby the destruction of the Amazon forest was a vital component of them if they were to operate in the way it was intended. And I think this is a very important last point. This last point, I think it's very important because of what you mentioned towards the end of your presentation, in the sense that we see today in Latin America a very important set of forces moving towards expanding the size of the welfare state, enhancing redistribution, enhancing the weight of social programs. But the thing is, how will the resources for this redistribution be obtained? And what we have seen in the case of Peru, in the research I've carried in Peru, in Chile, and in Brazil, what I've seen firsthand is that this is actually leading to a point where the degradation of the environment and the exacerbation of agro-industry will be one of the key drivers of this redistribution, together with extractive industries, mining, etc. So I think this is a very important setup to understand in the context of what we are discussing here, because we see that the driving forces of the destruction of the Amazon are not merely national forces, but also are part of larger regional dynamics and more fundamental social demands that will be very hard to tame in the light of environmental objectives. So my last point would be, well, what is to be done in relation to this? I mean, are we just to shut the door and say, okay, let's forget about planet A and let's hope for a planet B somewhere else? And this is where, interestingly, the not so renowned international level regarding environmental, the fight against climate change, has turned to be an interesting driver for containment of these dynamics as in recent years. Not so much by the times we were negotiating the Conference of Parts, not so much by the time we were striking deals and setting up green finance, but more fundamentally regarding the risks that climate change and the destruction of the Amazon is bringing forth to the world. We are seeing how, for instance, the main contributors and the main donors to Brazil for the preservation of the Amazon are backtracking. And this is clearly the case of Norway that halted everything in 2019, the Fundo Amazonian, and halting the influx of resources and forcing the Bolsonaro government to at one point come clean in relation to what they really were aspiring to do in the Amazon. But I think more interestingly too, we see how ODA, Official Development Agency, is increasingly pointing to the necessity of allocating resources, but only if a critical threshold of environmental preservation is actually comprised with it. And this is another very important element of change where the international community can actually have a say, and where different development agencies from different national technical cooperation organizations can actually play a very big role. Other tracks for influence that we could look for, and that can have an impact in the way environmental policies and the preservation of the Amazon can actually be reversed, are of course the negotiation of trade deals. Because as you mentioned, I mean, the intensive agriculture has a specific direction. It goes to markets that demand it. And here, the negotiation of these trade deals have been critical in, at one point, forcing up to restrict the dismantling of these overseeing agencies. And one concrete example has been the recent negotiation between the European Union and the Mercosur agreement, which of course we could criticize for many other reasons. It has been highly dysfunctional for most 20 years. But more interestingly now, the environmental component has been key in sidelining the position of Brazil, and at one point forcing it to review this particular approach. Last point I would like to mention regarding this is, of course, the Bank of International Settlements, which I think for me it's critical in the sense that now these days, we are increasingly linking financial risks to environmental risks. And this is actually having a consequence in the span of the action that the Brazilian National Development Bank can actually have. And I think it's important because the Brazilian National Development Bank, as of recent years, has been increasingly investing in this agro-business sector, to the point that the interests of the agro-business sector had become closely entrenched with the interests of the main driving organization for development in Brazil. So we have this set of structural forces, and we have this specific configuration for the production of public policies. But we have to acknowledge that there is an international dimension to it that can actually play a significant role, and maybe, who knows, counter some of these very nefarious consequences of intensive agro-industrialization, as you mentioned in your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia and Alvaro. So maybe Stephen, you want to add something to Alvaro's comments?
Sure, yeah, thank you. And also maybe to link into what Natalia said a little bit. So one of the things that my sociologists and economist colleagues in the region have been thinking about is whether these large industrial soy farms actually slow deforestation relative to regions elsewhere in Amazonia, where it's much more what you would call in Brazil peasant farmers or small landholders. And there's a good story to be told about how these national or multinational corporations are more scared if McDonald's or Walmart refuses to buy their soybeans because they're trading at that level, whereas the individual farmer who's going to clear some land to grow some crops for his family or maybe to sell in a local market, they're not selling to Walmart. But the historical context is really important here because a lot of land tenure, that is land ownership in the Amazon, is very unclear. And Brazil is in the middle of a attempt to register who owns what land. But right now there's a disconnect. And that means that a landholder, like a large corporation like Amagi or any of the other giant soybean producers, can get land and say, well, we didn't cut down the forest. It was cleared already, and we don't know who owned it, but now we're gonna farm it, and they can duck this international pressure. This is even more true in meat production, where companies attempt to not buy beef from recently deforested land that grazes on recently deforested land. Well, okay, you don't know who cut down the trees, but you're going to graze it, and you can avoid the consequences. So I guess the point I want to make is scientifically, we are very close to being able to see every single tree that is getting cut down all the time. So monitoring, which was a challenge when I started working on this in the early 2000s, monitoring of the entire Amazon was really not possible. We could detect large scale clear cutting, but we couldn't detect selective logging, and selective logging was often what preceded large scale clearing. We could detect roads, and we could watch deforestation along the roads in the classic fishbone pattern of roads. But now we can see every tree, almost. And so now it really is, to Alvaro's point, a matter of enforcement and political will. If you are willing to stop deforestation, if you are willing to put the resources there, we can see it when it happens. There are two real challenges. One is the will to enforce, and the other is knowing who owns the land so you can attribute responsibility. And until those two things come to bear, the historical legacy of settlement in the Amazon will not be sort of fixed by our ability to see deforestation. We'll just see it, but we still won't be able to stop it until the underlying social and political sort of trajectory of the Amazon has changed or changes. So I just wanted to sort of bring together this idea that our ability to monitor and for other countries to sort of say this is bad is disconnected from an ability to affect change on the ground because of the economic and social history of the region. And I think this is the case everywhere, right? It's particularly true in Brazil, at least to my knowledge, but I think these kinds of interactions are important. And to bring it back to the critical zone, right? I see a question in the chat that says how much phosphorus is still available in the world. That's a hotly debated question, and I think most people would agree that this is not a we're running out of it tomorrow problem. But as I said in the talk, there are really big geopolitical implications for tropical countries that are trying to intensify agriculture when they have almost no phosphorus reserves. So Brazil has been trying to increase its phosphorus supply, but even if it does that, it just doesn't have the right geology. So it's going to be dependent on imports if it hopes to continue as an agricultural powerhouse. There's just nothing to be done about that. So I think the bigger question is how much it's not that there's not a lot left, it's that the ore bodies that are left are either in very specific places, and actually Morocco and Western Sahara are engaged in a long fight about about sovereignty that ties to Morocco's ability to export phosphorus across Western Sahara. But I think the other problem is that there are other deposits around the world, but they're lower grade and cost more to develop into fertilizer because they have lots of contaminants like cadmium and so forth and so on. And so the price is going to go up as we have to exploit those lower grade deposits. And that's going to really impinge on our ability to put fertilizer in places where it's desperately needed. So there are still almost 1 billion malnourished people in the world that could be fed with access to more fertilizer. And that will grow as population growth is highest in the places where malnourishment is highest. So this is a real problem. Phosphorus presents a real problem because you can't get more of it than you have. It's not that we're going to run out right away. It's that the cost is going to go up, and that's going to limit our ability to reach some goals in terms of human well-being.
Thank you. So maybe it's time to ask the room whether we have questions. Richard, you raised your hand, or?
I can try a question. Very interesting. Okay, Stephen, thank you very much. I think you mentioned this in your argument, but I missed the point.
We hardly hear you. We hardly hear you, Richard.
Can you hear me better?
Slightly, yeah.
Okay, I'm pushing my mic as much as I can. Okay.
Peut-être, parce que je ne peux pas.
So I write my question.
Pendant que Richard écrit sa question, s'il y a d'autres personnes qui veulent poser des questions, n'hésitez pas.
Richard a demandé pourquoi on peut pas substitute, je sais pas le mot. Why is there no substitute for phosphorus? So that's a great question. So phosphorus is one of the elements that is needed for all life. It's part of DNA. It's part of ATP, which is what powers cells. All organisms on the planet need it. And so there's no substitute because like other atoms, we don't know of any life form that can exist without it. The difference between phosphorus and nitrogen is that nitrogen is wildly abundant in our atmosphere. It makes up 80% of our atmosphere. It only requires energy to take it from the atmosphere and import it into a form that organisms like us or plants can use. So that process can be done chemically, industrially, and it just requires energy. But we will never run out because we are bathed in nitrogen in the atmosphere. We are surrounded by more than we could ever use. And once we're done using it, it cycles back to the atmosphere very rapidly anyway. So it's just, it's wildly abundant. It's also irreplaceable, but we won't ever run out. I like the contrast to oil, because like phosphorus, oil exists in geologic deposits. So there's a set amount of it on Earth. so when we run out, we run out. But oil is replaceable because we can run our world off solar power or wind or other renewable, well, really solar power or wind, potentially some geothermal. But so oil is finite, like phosphorus, but it's completely replaceable. Phosphorus is the third pillar of our society. If you take the critical zone view that I do, without it, we would not have succeeded in the 20th or 21st century. But it has this unfortunate property of being completely irreplaceable, like nitrogen, and finite, like oil. And so it presents a particularly important challenge in terms of its conservation, because when it's gone, we have no other option. And so,
if I may, Stephen, phosphorus, contrary to oil, can be recycled. I mean, it's not, disappearing after use. Like,
Yes.
organic carbon molecules are destroyed, but phosphorus is not destroyed.
Ah oui, c'est vrai. And that brings us to a really important point, which I didn't make, but I would be, but thank you for making me make it. Right now, the way that we use this particular element is very linear. So we harvest it from mines, we put it on farm fields, it goes into our crops or it gets stuck in the soil. We eat the crops or animals eat the crops, it goes out the other side and into the ocean, where it is very dilute and basically impossible to get back. And so one of the things that I think has to happen to agriculture over this century is a mechanism for recycling phosphorus, both the phosphorus that animals consume when they are consuming crops and the phosphorus that humans consume. But without that, so Jerome is absolutely right. This is a problem that is fixable, but right now our society is not set up to fix it. So, and part of this problem is exacerbated dramatically by global trade. So imagine a molecule of phosphorus, it's mined in Morocco, it's processed into fertilizer somewhere in the world, shipped to Brazil, carried by truck 12 hours over very bumpy roads to Mato Grosso, dumped on a farm field, taken up in a soybean plant, trucked back to a port, shipped to China where it's fed to a pig, eaten by a human who then excretes it into the South China Sea, right? And once it's there, getting it back to Brazil to grow more crops is a tricky problem. Add to that within Brazil itself, a large percentage of the population is not even on any sewage treatment, let alone recycling of the sewage. And this is a major urban challenge because more than 50% of the world's population lives in cities, and that number is only increasing. So how we get that recycling is, I think, one of the major challenges of the 21st century, but it is absolutely critical given the finite, irreplaceable nature of the element. So Joan, thank you for pointing me there.
So we had a question from Natalia and then Alvaro.
You can go first, Alvaro.
You're muted.
Okay.
Go.
Okay. I don't know.
Please.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, I had actually two questions, but I'll start with a comment about this very interesting issue of land tenure in the Amazon, which is very important because they are, as you said, they are so much linked, like big farms in the region and the dynamic of deforestation. Because since land tenure is very unstable in the region, the big corporations, the big farms, they depend on people going up to the frontier of deforestation and clearing land to expand their business, but without the work and without the image. And that really shows in the current context in Brazil with Bolsonaro government, with one part of the agribusiness kind of tensed with the actions of the government because they're having a bad image abroad. So there are all this boycott, this Mercosur agreement with the European Union. So there is a part of the agribusiness that is kind of concerned, but at the same time, they don't do anything to change the status quo because they depend on this logic in the Amazon and other regions in Brazil, in the Pantanal and in the Cerrado, to keep on expanding their business without intensification of their practice. And that was what I wanted to ask. Is there a possibility of ecological intensification of agriculture in the region, considering the critical zone that they're being, the critical zone in this place? I don't know exactly how to use this concept, but it also like sort of naive question, because it seems to me that it's totally inadapted to make soy in this region. And if the goal is to feed the population, as you titled your presentation, maybe other less invasive forms of agriculture that need less input of fertilizers would be more adapted. And the other question was more a curiosity. Because you mentioned in your presentation that you did a field work and then your students went from farm to farm asking for some data. And would the farmers just give the data like this? Because I have experience in field work in farms in the Amazon, and it was always very complicated, but maybe it's because I'm coming from social sciences and I'm Brazilian, so maybe it changes something. So it's a curiosity.
Okay, great. So these are several good questions. Okay, so first of all, yes, there are ways to improve Brazilian agriculture in terms of its effect on the environment. I think one of the keys is to reintegrate animals into farming. And Brapa and others are starting to think about how to do that. So Brazilian cattle herd is something like 300 million. It's an unbelievable amount of cows. Those animals are grazed on very poor soils without any phosphorus fertilizer. And as a result, the soils degrade very quickly, and that requires more deforestation. So one thing one could do is actually add some fertilizer to the pasture and have more animals per area, which would potentially reduce the need for land. But this only works if you have enforcement, because we have a very high demand for meat, and that demand is growing worldwide. Although in Europe and the United States, actually beef consumption peaked in the 70s and has been declining ever since, especially in the US. I know actually a little bit less about Europe. So improving pastures with strict enforcement about deforestation is one way to make ecological progress. Of course, the real answer globally is to eat less red meat, particularly beef. We feed almost all of our corn and soybeans globally to animals. We don't eat it ourselves. And that requires huge amounts of land that would not be needed for agriculture at all if we didn't eat particularly beef. Now, convincing Brazilians to eat less beef is like convincing the French to eat less cheese or drink less wine. So it's very, very difficult. And you know, my cheese consumption has gone through the roof since I moved here. So, and I'm very grateful for it. But we do, in all seriousness, need to eat fewer animals. That's the only path to sustainable agriculture, in my opinion. Jerome is criticizing me for stereotypes. What do you say, Ray? I disagree with your point, Natalia, a little bit about less intensive agriculture, and the reason that, and there are sort of subtleties to it, but for a given number of calories, if you have less intensive agriculture, you need more land. Now, of course, there's subtlety to that, because as you have more intensive agriculture, you can do things like feed your crops to animals and not worry about eating them, because there's so much abundance and it's so heavily subsidized that we can waste the food that way. We can make it into biofuel, for example, which is another terrible idea. But in general, at the sort of highest level, my philosophy is actually that we are soon to be 10 billion people. We have a huge footprint on the planet. We are going to need to use land for agriculture. We need to reintegrate animals into that. We need to provide passageways across that for species that are moving as a result of climate change. But I don't think that lack of intensive agriculture is the answer. I actually think that probably intensive agriculture with strict environmental regulation is probably more likely to be sustainable in the long run, although this idea of a small farm that's very not intensive is wonderful. I think in reality, that just leads to more land being used, in my opinion. And I think you see this, for example, we use a huge, almost a quarter of the Earth's surface to graze animals at very low intensity. And that land is, pretty badly degraded for not a lot of nutrition for people. Now, that's not true everywhere. There are places where, animals provide a bank account essentially for very low income people. So, it's a way of gathering calories from landscapes that don't provide a lot of calories. So there is nuance to this, but anyway, those are some thoughts.
Varun?
Yes. Well, great question. It's funny what you were mentioning about not convincing Brazilians to eat less meat, because I remember in Brazil there was this campaign at the time I was doing some research there, was eat more meat. Actually, it was very clear. It was coma mais carne, it was posted everywhere. But
well, we have this in the U.S. right now. Colorado declared a meat-free day in their and so Nebraska, which is right next to Colorado, declared an eat meat day. And I in my slides, I actually have the Le Monde headline about the fight in Lyon about vegetarian day on in the schools. It's the end of the world.
It's come to that. No, yeah. but more seriously, I had 3 points, very brief points that I'd like to raise. First of all, regarding the whole discussion we're having about this whole idea of touching the limits and putting that also into the historical perspective that Natalia brought forth, which is the sense that the Amazon was always this sort of unlimited territory to conquer. See, that was the whole idea of reaching to the limits, the conquering territory. And I cannot help to think about other examples of places I've done research. I mean, in Chile and also in Malaysia when I was in Southeast Asia, and how the notion of having a finitude of a territory has actually contributed greatly to, at one point, also framing the issue in different terms. See, when you see the direct environmental consequences of what intensive agriculture, which is the case in Chile with avocado, or in Malaysia with palm oil trees, then the perception is entirely different, and the way the problem is built as an issue changes also quite dramatically. But that was more of a comment, but I don't know, maybe you had some reaction in relation to that. The other element was also in relation to this comparison, what I did with these other countries, because one thing that also was very present in Malaysia, for instance, was the consequences of these intensive fertilizers, which I assume they were also utilizing phosphorus for water streams and water systems. And I was wondering whether you had some sort of input in that particular capacity, in the sense that yes, there is the land, but also the water streams upon which many of these communities at one point depend, or nearby communities might be dependent upon, and which takes us to the last paradox, which is the one of, again, why do we need this intensive agriculture, or to whose benefit? It has been clearly established, big agro-business multinationals, but there's also in the rhetoric of the government this whole idea that it brings social progress. I mean, the question being, if we degrade the land and we degrade water streams and hydric systems, I mean, well, those small communities that should see their lot improve by this intensive agriculture, at the end of the day, we'll see the exact opposite happening. And where you had encountered some of these communities and at one point discussed, or had they voiced some concerns in relation to what they saw as environmental degradation with their own eyes. Yeah.
So on that last point, I would say that the research that's been done by my colleagues in Mato Grosso specifically, and I don't want to go out beyond that, has shown that that there is really profound social and economic benefit to the regions that have embraced this type of agriculture. That does not include the indigenous communities living still in the forest, who are seeing their land shrink and their climate change, and in other parts of the Amazon, and probably here too, facing unbelievable violence and oppression. So I want to make that clear. But for towns like Canarana, for example, or other other soy towns in Brazil, for lack of a better word, there's more access to education, there's more access to medicine, there's higher incomes. One of the really interesting things about these giant farms is that there are very few people on them. They're hugely mechanized. And so on the farm where we work, there's a little town that has its own school on the farm. But then everybody else lives elsewhere, and it doesn't employ very many people. And actually there's way more, for example, big animals than any other place in the tropics I've worked, because there aren't people out shooting them for bushmeat or for fun, because there's no one on the farm. So it's really kind of interesting. And it's not always intuitive what the answer is. In terms of do we need the industrial agriculture, this was a debate in the 70s. It continues to this day, and I think the answer is absolutely yes. We cannot feed. I mean, that graph I showed at the beginning with synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, we could feed about 4 billion people without it, and there's not 4 billion people. There's 8, soon to be 10, and we need that fertilizer and we need mechanization. And the question is, can we reimagine? So in the US and Europe, the post-war period was all about food production, and malnutrition plummeted. And everywhere in the world that has adopted industrial agriculture has seen malnutrition plummet. That's a huge benefit to human society that I wouldn't want to reverse. But we are now seeing the consequences of our overuse, our missteps, our poor policy. And we have an opportunity to move, not to reverse and say, forget it, we don't want nutrients anymore. We can't do that. But we can say, oh, nutrients bring us this huge benefit. How can we reimagine our farming system to get the benefit and minimize the consequences? I see this as a direct analogy to climate change. Fossil fuels allowed for the emergence of modern society with all of the benefits that we all enjoy. We are now facing the consequences of a byproduct of fossil fuels that we didn't seek out, but now we are stuck with. And now we have an opportunity to say, we love having access to all of this energy. Can we do it in a way where we don't have to face the bad consequences? We are not saying, let's turn off the lights and not use energy anymore. We're going to continue to use energy, and we're going to continue to use nutrients. But can we think wisely about managing the downside, even as we enjoy the upside? And so that's how I conceptualize this. This is not I don't think this is a time to try to go backwards and not use nutrients and not use the technology that we have. It's a way of, I think, moving forward and saying, can we improve so that we don't face the downside and get the upside? At least that's my perception of the way forward.
Thank you. So do we have other questions or comments?
Maybe I do have one, actually. I'd be very interested, Stephen, because you've been talking well about Brazil this evening and mainly focusing on this country. And I think you've worked in other regions of the world or also on other areas. So I guess my question is, in relationship to the themes and the issues that you've just described and that you mentioned in your talk, how specific is this case of Brazil? Is it particularly relevant, or are there other regions in the world where you've been observing some similar areas? This is particularly interesting for us, the work we're doing at the Centre de Politique de la Terre, also trying to both show the specificities of the territories we're working on, but also trying to highlight some of the commonalities worldwide. So we've been wondering how to push this further. Alvaro's been mentioning Malaysia and some of the developments taking place in Southeast Asia. You've been talking about the US. So how is this taking scope together globally and in terms of the trends that we're seeing?
Thank you, Charlotte. That's a great question. So I touched on it only very briefly at the end, and I guess I should come back to that part. So one of the things I think that links Brazil to the rest of the world and makes it a really good example, or at least much of the tropical world or the lowland tropical world, is that the same kinds of soil that underlie these major agricultural regions in Brazil underlie a lot of the regions in Africa, for example, to which Brazil is now trying to export the same model. And so It's less relevant to Southeast Asia because the critical zone there is different. These are volcanic islands. They have a very different geology, a very different soil history, a very different hydrology. But in terms of the export of corn and soy production to other parts of the world, we are seeing this, and we're seeing this kind of intensification across these soils that until the 80s were thought to be unfarmable. So Natalia mentioned some research to bring soy to the forest, and so there was a lot of agronomic effort to develop varieties of soybeans that could deal with the amount of daylight in the tropics as opposed to the amount of daylight in the temperate zone. In fact, on the farm where this research is from, they actually plant 13 different varieties of soy across the farm so that they don't all ripen at the same time because they can't harvest them all at once because it's so big. And so the development of those new crops and then the availability of fertilizer and other things has really allowed soy to migrate. To Natalia's point earlier, sugarcane is on its way to the region because Brazil has this idea that they're going to be energy independent by growing sugar for ethanol. It's a pipe dream, but it's going to be a huge driver of deforestation, in my opinion. But anyway, so this idea is I think likely to be most exportable to the African context because of the similarity in the critical zone. And of course, there you have a different social, political, economic history that means that so far fertilizer is very unavailable. Farms are largely losing nutrients year after year because they can't, because fertilizer is so expensive. And as a result, you have the highest rates of malnourishment basically in the world. And so there's the question of how you also have the highest population growth rates in the world. It's the only place where population growth rates are still 3 to 5 children per woman as opposed to 2 to 3, or even fewer than 2 in Europe. So this is where this is going to play out in the coming decades.
Stephen, I had a quick question. So
right.
we talked about phosphorus and the need for applying phosphorus to the crops in Brazil. But what about the pesticides and herbicides that are probably needed? Isn't it another catastrophe with this regards?
So this is a great question that I only have anecdotal evidence for because we have not been able to analyze. It's very expensive to analyze for pesticides because each one is a different molecule and it requires an enormous amount of cost and effort. And so there are some Brazilians who are trying to study this. I am sure that this is a catastrophe, but I have no data because we haven't been able to sample enough in the rivers. I do know, I mean, you watch the planes flying around spraying pesticides, it's kind of terrifying. If you check into a hotel in Canarana, there's like a list of pesticides next to the Bible next to the bed. I mean, it's big agribusiness. I don't know, but I don't know very much about the full consequences and how those consequences interact with the soil. I've been actually looking for someone who'd be interested in studying that, but it's not my area of expertise, and it's a wide open area of research. I don't think we really have good answers. But it's a good
one of the reasons I'm asking is that we have a similar problem in Guadeloupe, and in general in the Lesser Antilles, which is a chlordecone catastrophe. Actually, the chlordecone is now forbidden, but it has been widely applied 20 years ago. And now we just into realizing the consequences of this application. So, it's a problem that you can have in many years after the first use of these pesticides. So it's really an important problem, I think. That should be considered. And this is really, again, like phosphorus, that's really linked linked to the structure and architecture of the critical zone, because it depends on the soil, it depends on the clays, it depends on very small details, you know, that we natural scientists are most of the time not able to characterize or to understand. So that's really a critical zone problem in the way that we still need, you know, a lot of scientific progresses and discoveries to understand the system. Alvaro, you have a new question?
Yes, thank you. No, it was in relation with what Stephen mentioned just a second ago about this expansion of operations to Africa. Natalia wrote a small thing in the chat. It is interesting to see that this model actually has been supported by the National Development Bank through Embrapa, which is this Brazilian agency, and actually it was aimed, as you mentioned, for sugar cane, for ethanol, but it was also intended to support the capacity to nourish your population. I mean, the production of food, independence in production of food. And my question was, if you had seen anything occur in the way of the cooperation between China and Brazil, in the sense that China is developing right now the ultimate frontier for actually self-nourishment, as the ability to nourish its population. And they look into the Brazilian case with a lot of interest, saying, well, you guys have nailed it. I mean, you are able to just produce the necessary foods that you need for your country. I mean, I was wondering if you had seen any sort of this cooperation happen, or but maybe I ask Richard also, there's an interest in Asia as well. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe someone knows about this.
So I defer to Richard. I'm not an expert in Brazil-China relations. I will only say that a huge amount of Brazilian soy is going to China, as I said before. But you're right that China's fertilizer use dwarfs everybody else in the world. They are putting so much fertilizer on their farm fields. It's sort of unimaginable. However, they are aware of the huge costs and problems associated with that, and policy is changing. Again, I make the link to fossil fuels. They're aware of the coal problem, but they're still building coal-fired power plants, and they're aware of the nutrient problem, but they're still way overusing nutrients. And so, but I don't know more than that. I would defer to Richard.
Okay, thank
You hear
you.
me?
Yes, Richard.
Alors, si vous m'entendez, if you can hear me, yes, this is very true. I had a PhD student writing a dissertation on agriculture policy in China, and she came up with this figure where Chinese farmers use 8 times more fertilizer per hectare than French farmers, 8 times. So it's really huge. And the percentage of arable land in China is very limited, very exploited. And this is why they use so much fertilizer. The soil is poor, so they push it as much as they can. And the pastures, in particular in Manchuria, because Chinese eating habits have evolved, so Chinese people like to consume more and more meat and more beef, which was not very common in the past. But so they need beef, and they graze their pastures. They overgraze and they destroy their natural pastures in Manchuria in particular. The government is aware of this and is trying to limit it. So maybe to the difference of Brazil, there is a political will there, but the demand is very strong, and so the Chinese are both overexploiting their agricultural capacity and looking to Africa, Brazil, wherever they can invest, and even in France, even in Europe. So this is what I can add to the comment or the question for Alvaro. But I also had a comment or a question or something. I'd really like that we come back to this issue of food production, the Amazon, the history of the Amazon. And I was thinking, listening to you, that this global dimension is very, very interesting because, in fact, if you think of I happen to have read a couple of years ago the memories of Tocqueville, as the liberty to tell you this small anecdote because Stephen is a Tocqueville chair. So it's, Tocqueville, when he did his trip to America, it was 1840, if I remember well. And he travels to New York to what is now Detroit. And when he reaches the level of what is now, I would say, halfway New York State, his narrative, he travels in the primary forest with some Indian guide. And it's very astonishing, very, very striking. So deforestation in this, what is now Midwest in the US has been as intensive as we can see it in Brazil today. And this was, of course, related to food security in Europe, because at least Italian and Irish migrants crossed the Atlantic very much because the food security conditions were not met in Europe. So I'm sure there is a sort of global environmental history taking this into account and telling this story and connecting this early phase of global environmental history to what we see now. But I don't know if you have a comment, Natalia, in particular. I'm sure you're well aware of this literature and these problematics, but I think we have to look at it a little bit in this perspective of early colonialist and colonial processes, but also to look at the continuity between this and this globalization of food production today.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it took about 100 years after Tocqueville for the US to completely deplete its soils without fertilizer. And it was only the invention of fertilizer that allowed the post-war period to recover food production. I have a colleague in Iowa who tells me that in 1850, there were 16 inches. So what would that be? Like 30 centimeters? No, 40 centimeters of topsoil, and now there's about 20. And when that's gone, there's no more productivity in the Midwestern US. So unlike Brazil, actually, where the soil is terrible to begin with, and they just basically all it does is hold the plants up, and then they provide everything else with chemicals. In the US, we require the water holding and structure and in Europe too, of the soil. And when that's gone because of erosion or mismanagement, there's no getting it back. So it's interesting because of that. Now, I just wanted to very quickly share my screen. I know we're running out of time here, but here's fertilizer use to your point about China. I mean, it's just off the charts. Nobody's using as much fertilizer as China. It's insane. And if you go back in time, very recently, as early as 2002, they're still using more, but look at the change, it's just stunning. So anyway.
Okay. So yeah, Natalia, you want to add something?
No, I just wanted to make a comment in relation to what Richard was saying. I don't think there is a systematic global environmental history done about this process, but there are many national examples, mostly in the United States, so around this literature about the frontier history, but in other countries as well. But in the Brazilian case, there is this very interesting work by Warren Dean about the deforestation of the Atlantic facade of the Brazil during the colonization, because as many historians and geographers say, what happened in the Atlantic facade in Brazil is the prelude of what's happening in the Amazon now, because before it was totally covered by forest. And I think, I don't know, I just wanted to make a comment. I don't know what you think about this, Stephen, but what I was saying before is not that I think that we have to make less intense agriculture, but about the adequacy of doing soya in forest zones, and not some other production that would be less input, with less input of fertilizers, not less intensive, but maybe other production, because I think this idea of intensifying agriculture is very important in the Brazilian case, because agriculture in general in Brazil is very extensive and not very, how do you say, doesn't yield very much. It could be better, it could be more intensive in areas that are already deforested, already occupied by farms. Because the problem, I think, with the Amazon region is that we really have to protect the forest frontier, because taking down the forest would not be interesting neither for feeding the planet, neither for Brazilian economy, because as many climatologists research have shown, the conditions that make agriculture possible in other regions in Brazil, especially the central west and the southeast region, is because of the Amazonian forest that allow for rain patterns to continue. So I think it's important to stress that the forest standing is more lucrative for Brazil, I guess, in many senses than the forest destroyed.
So I think that's a good note to end on. I completely agree. There doesn't need to be another tree cut in the Amazon. I think the question is, in fact, there should never be another tree cut in the Amazon. The question is, what sort of land uses around the Amazon will minimize the need for land and allow even forests to regrow? One thing we haven't talked about, more than half of the world's tropical forests are now regrowing from recent disturbance. And the forest has an enormous capacity to come back. But it doesn't have an enormous capacity to come back from things like 100 years of soybean production, of sugarcane production, I'm sorry. So yeah, I completely agree. We should figure out the social, economic, and political conditions that allow for productive agriculture without incentivizing movement into the forest for more. Part of the problem, right, with these big groups is they see how profitable soy can be. So they push the small scale farmers, just as you said, into the forest to cut more land, then they buy them out and then they grow soy. And this is not a sustainable model. Yeah, so I completely agree with you. And this idea of sort of fuel and food self-sufficiency. Fuel is trickier, but food could be done without cutting another tree down. And certainly sugarcane for ethanol is a disaster waiting to happen as it invades the Amazon. So you have no argument for me on that front. In terms of soy itself, soy is a legume, and that means it doesn't need nitrogen fertilizer at all. It gets its own nitrogen from the air, unlike corn, unlike rice, unlike wheat. And so in terms of need for inputs, yes, it does require a lot of phosphorus, but it has the advantage of not requiring any nitrogen. And so it's not, if we were eating that soy directly and not feeding it to animals, I think it's actually a pretty productive crop that has relatively low environmental consequences relative to the other big crops that we currently grow. There are other things, but.
Okay, thank you. It's 7 o'clock, so I think we should finish this very interesting seminar. So thank you for all of us. Thank you to the Chileans. Thank you to the Parisians. And I hope you enjoyed the discussion. So merci Stephen.
Thank you for inviting me.
C'était très intéressant. Et donc bonne soirée à tous et à bientôt.
Merci, Jérôme. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you.
Merci. Au revoir.